I'm not exactly sure how to start this video. In fact, I think almost everybody wants to just scream into the void, but they're not exactly sure how to go about screaming into the void on this one. So I'll go ahead and make the beginning of this fairly brief. Yesterday, the Commander's Rules Committee for Magic the Gathering decided that they were going to hand off stewardship of the Commander format to Wizards of the Coast. Now, I have my own tinfoil-hatted thoughts on this that I can get into in a bit, but they're less important than getting words from the horse's mouth. So, as of September 30th, the Commander Rules Committee has said, as a result of the threats last week against Rules Committee members, it has become impossible for us to continue operating as an independent entity. Given that, we have asked Wizards of the Coast to assume responsibility for Commander, and they will be making decisions and announcements going forward. We are sad about the end of this era, and hopefully, for the future, WotC has given strong assurances that they do not want to change the vision of the format. Committee members have been invited to contribute as individual advisors to the new management framework. The RC would like to express our gratitude to all CAG members who have contributed their wisdom and their perspective over the years. Finally, we want to thank all the players who have made this game so successful. We look forward to interacting as members of the community. Please be excellent to each other. Now, I think it's important to note why this has happened. They basically said so in the post, but I'll go ahead and spell it out. This was a failure of the Magic the Gathering community. Hands down, this is, in every way, shape, and form, a thing that we, as a group, created. Let me go ahead and explain. So, a while ago, conversations had started internally from the Rules Committee that there were certain cards that were accelerating games of Commander far past the point of fun for most players. And while these cards were very, very well suited for what we now know as CEDH, or Competitive Elder Dragon Highlander, they were not well suited to casual tables, where most people can crack open a pre-constructed deck that they could buy for $40 and sit down and play. Now, before somebody starts screaming about proxies, I hear you, and I understand where you're coming from, but that's not the point here, because, yeah, if that player proxied in every Mana Crypt and Dockside Extortionist, we would just have games that only had those cards. And Gavin Verhey recently decided to say on a Twitch stream that one of the problems with Commander design that Wizards has ran into is making cards that are the best in the world at what they do. Eventually, you get into an issue where you have your Commander and a Command Tower and a Soul Ring and an Arcane Signet, and you start going down the list, and every card is the same. And this is actually what we see at CEDH tables. There's a common refrain from CEDH players that you don't really get to brew CEDH. There's an established meta, and that meta gets shaken up every once in a while when new cards come out, but generally speaking, the actual brewing process, for most people, never gets to be a starter. And this is the case for most competitive card games. Most players who enjoy playing Modern, or Standard, or Yu-Gi-Oh!, or Pokemon, or any of these games at a competitive level, generally speaking, do not have the opportunity to brew, or rather, they have the opportunity to brew for about 10 minutes, and then they sit down to a tournament table, and they get shown the door. And now they don't really get to do that anymore. They need to go for whatever the most efficient tactic available is. That is what meta stands for, after all. And this creates kind of a problem with Commander, because Commander is the one format that is a brewer's paradise, where no matter what, you have the ability to express how you are as a player in Commander. And to Gavin's point, if these best cards at what they do, Dockside is the best red ramp, Mana Crypt is the best ramp possible in Commander, Jeweled Lotus is the best explosive start any Commander could ask for. Once you start printing so many of these cards, you only have two options. One, print them into the ground, and now everybody has access to them, but now everybody having access to them just means that you have all of these homogenous games. Even non-CEDH games now suddenly become a, kind of bastardized mirror of a type of Magic the Gathering, a type of commander that most players just don't want to play. And then when you take that into account, the only other option is to have some way to keep those cards away from players. And typically, the way to keep those cards away from players has been to price them away from players. This ideally would not have been by design, but I'm not going to leave it to Hasbro to be the ones to tell me whether or not they ever truly meant for Dockside, which was printed in a pre-con and then never reprinted again until they could print it as a chase card in a booster set later. I'm just going to go ahead and assume that they saw the card was printing money for a precon, and instead of lowering its price through availability, decided to make more money from it. Now, it should be noted as well that the Rules Committee did actually say in a statement that the price of these cards was not the reason why they were banned. They were banned because these cards had a negative effect on most players' play experience, and you can see their words on that whenever you get a chance to. Now, why, though, did I say that this was a failure of the Magic the Gathering community, of us as a group of people? Well, to put it simply, we are the ones that gave the death threats. Not we, as in specifically me and you, the viewer, but we, the collective Magic the Gathering community. The vitriol, the outrage, the poor social skills, all of that combined into people shouting down members of the Rules Committee to the point where they decided that they just didn't need to deal with it anymore. It was a thankless job to begin with, stewarding a format that people complain about all the time at every single level of play, and they did it effectively for free. Like, they were not paid by Wizards of the Coast to be the stewards of the format. So, at the end of the day, what were they doing it for? And it should be noted, people were throwing all of these threats at members of the Rules Committee, irrespective of where they stood on the issue. Even Olivia, who was one of the members of the committee, who tried to argue that we should only be banning Nadu and Dockside and let Jeweled Lotus and Mana Crypt wait for the format to shake out and just keep analyzing the card and kind of let people understand that they have their eyes on that card, those two cards. She was one of the ones who was arguing not to do the bans the way that the Rules Committee ultimately did, and yet she was getting all this harassment as well. So it didn't matter whose opinion was what. Death threats were levied at people in the Rules Committee, and they never deserved them in the first place, regardless of how they wanted to steward your game. At the end of the day, Magic the Gathering is a card game, okay? It may be a wonderful experience that brings all kinds of people together and takes people from disparate social and economic situations and puts them in the same room on the same level to play a game that we all love. But it is still a game. It is no different than Monopoly or checkers. All things considered, there is no world, there is no realm where you should want to harm another human being, especially in regards to a fucking game. Unfortunately, we seem to have a community of people who put the price of their cardboard over the actual value of a real human life. I don't know what to chalk that up to, besides potentially sociopathy, but apparently we have enough of those people that enough of these death threats were sent to all of the members of the Rules Committee in such a consistent fashion that they decided to hand off the game to Wizards of the Coast. Now, Wizards already had a share of control over Commander for a variety of reasons I'll elucidate in a minute, but this is not a scenario that I think any of us really wanted. We like to talk about the Rules Committee not doing their job and how they didn't do enough in X, Y, or Z scenario. The thing is, none of us are ever going to agree on any of that. We're going to all have different ideas of what Commander is to us, and then the game's going to exist with or without us as players. Because as of right now, it is one of the largest formats of any card game ever. It's going to continue operating for a decent while. The format's not dead, and those of you who have quit over the banning of a single piece of fast mana that you didn't even need to run in every one of your decks in the first place. I don't know. This community confuses me. If I can tangent on that for just a moment, the people who decided to quit because their Dockside Extortionist, their Jeweled Lotus, and their Mana Crypt were banned, kindly, can I ask you a question? What the flying fuck were the other 97 cards in your deck? Like, what were those? Why were those that? Why even play any other cards in your deck if losing only those cards meant your deck didn't get to work anymore? Like, let's say as an example, Thassa's Oracle gets banned tomorrow. You think people aren't going to just run Laboratory Maniac for that WinCon like they did before the printing of Thassa's Oracle? This is just a quick peep into the strange collective mind of the Magic the Gathering community. I remember when I was a child, and a friend of mine and I said that there would be riots in the street if Standard existed without a Llanowar Elf in Magic the Gathering, if we didn't get a Llanowar Elf in Standard. And lo and behold, Standard has had no Llanowar Elf or Llanowar Elf style card in it for a very long time. We're only going to be getting one in Foundations here in a bit. But that naive position of mine, that naive, childlike idea that one card that was very, very important to me suddenly meant that I would not be able to play the game anymore, other people wouldn't play the game anymore. It was a ludicrous opinion then, and people acting on the modern-day adult equivalent of that opinion are insane to me. Quite frankly, if your deck required a Mana Crypt to run, then you didn't have a deck in the first place. You had a pile, and it was leaning on a piece of power, and it was the only reason that your deck was functioning was that piece of power. That doesn't mean you had a well-built deck. I'm sorry. I am sorry. That is an opinion that I am willing to just sit on forever. It's like if somebody says, oh, without Sol Ring in my deck, I will never be able to keep up, ignoring the fact that Sol Ring is a variance card that not everybody draws in their opening turns. Like, it's a crazy opinion to me that ignores the other 97, 96, 95 cards in your deck that are doing similar jobs at varying power levels. Anyway, that is an aside. That is an opinion of mine. That is past the point, but it is a good segue into the conversation of power level that was brought up by Gavin in a recent live stream that we need to talk about as well. So today there was a live stream between Blake and Gavin and Aaron Forsyth all about the future of Commander, and this power bracket idea was brought up. This is an interesting one for me, and I want to go over some of it right now. Let's go ahead and take a bit of a zoom in on here. The idea behind the power brackets is instead of a ban list, there will still be a ban list. Like, there's still going to be a ban list. That's not being taken out of the game. But instead of relying solely on a ban list, there will actually be a bucket of cards at varying power levels that will kind of showcase what your deck is, how powerful your deck is. Think about it kind of like how Canadian Highlander has its 10-point system, where the majority of cards in the game are worth 0 points, but there are certain cards, like, say, Sol Ring, that will be worth more in the Commander format, and those point values determine the power of your deck. It's actually a bit like those old Yu-Gi-Oh games on the Game Boy that had a limited number of power slots for a deck, where as you leveled up, you got more of them to make the game feel more like an RPG. That said, let's go ahead and look at what the idea here is. And they've only just now started fleshing the idea out, so things like the number of brackets, the names of the brackets, and the cards that go in every bracket are, subject to change. But looking at the Commander power brackets, at power level 4, or the highest power level, this would include cards like Vampiric Tutor and Armageddon. These are cards that are very salt-inducing in a game. If I play Vampiric Tutor, you can bet your ass it's going for my win con, and if it's not going for my win con, then I'm probably playing Magic the Gathering incorrectly. The idea behind a tutor card is that you should be able to grab whatever toolbox thing your deck needs at the time, but 9 times out of 10, the toolbox thing you need is the thing that ends the game and wins the game for you. In a deck that contains infinite combos like Demonic Consultation with Thassa's Oracle, the likelihood that your Vampiric Tutor just grabs the Demonic Consultation is very, very high. This is typically what the card is used for. And I don't want to hear that you personally have used it to tutor up a Path to Exile to prevent yourself from dying to my Niv Mizzet. That was actually an ad nauseum, and yes, somebody had to ad nause for a Path to Exile to stop my Niv Mizzet from killing him when I brought my $15 Niv Mizzet deck out. That's not an edge case that I'm going to worry about, because we can't actually make decisions for a format as big as Commander based on edge cases. That's just not a thing that we're able to do with the manpower that exists even in the entirety of the Commander community. And cards like Armageddon, while not played strictly at a bunch of CDH tables, it is not one of the most powerful cards in the game. It is a card that 100% of the time induces salt. Unless the player who plays Armageddon is guaranteed winning the turn that they play it, chances are nobody is going to be happy about it. I know that I personally, when somebody used an Armageddon in a Kali of the Vast deck against me and my friends at a table, they cast the Armageddon while Kalia was out, and I said, okay, if that's what you want to do. And she saw that I didn't have any mana open, and nobody did, and thought that that was going to be the end of it. But, you know, there's this funny thing called Ashnod's Altar, and this funny commander called Savra. And so I made us all lose all of our creatures, and so Kalia of the Vast never got to resolve any of her abilities, and she got to play the rest of the game with no mana. Because, I'm sorry, if you are going to play Armageddon and make the game incredibly painful for all of us, I am going to at the very least make sure that some of that pain is on you instead. That said, that is a very salty response to an Armageddon, but please note, this is a response that most players have when they see a player casting Armageddon, or really anything that slows the game down to a grinding halt like a Winter's Orb or any other stacks piece like that. So those are the cards that would be considered high power, not necessarily the most powerful cards in Magic, but the cards that elucidate those responses or typically go in those directions. Please note, and Gavin did note this in the live stream, it doesn't matter that you personally don't play the card that way, because everybody can make these fringe case apologetics for cards, but the community cannot base its rules on a billion fringe cases. They have to base them off of what typically happens, because that's the only way that you're going to be able to make an informed decision, based off of what happens 95+% of the time. 95+% of the time, when a player casts a Vampiric Tutor, they are going for a win con. 95+% of the time, when somebody casts an Armageddon, the game is going to grind to a halt because of some kind of disruption. Now, power level 3, it looks like they have different cards. Drannith Magistrate was one of the ones that was noted here specifically, and this is where I start to have a little bit of my disagreements. I feel like Drannith Magistrate is in the same realm as Armageddon. Yes, it is easier to respond to as it is a 2-mana creature, but in my opinion, a card like Drannith Magistrate grinds the game to a halt in the exact same way. People build their decks around their commanders, and inability to cast their commanders for the foreseeable future creates a bad environment. But I can see how, since it is easier to respond to, that it would be in power level 3 and not in the same category as Armageddon. Going down the list, though, you'll see that they have an example of a tutor here, where Personal Tutor is at level 3, and this is because, unlike Vampiric Tutor, Personal Tutor grabs only a sorcery card and then puts it on the top. It is far more narrow in what it can grab. Once you go to power level 2, now we have a Fabricate instead, grabbing only an artifact. The amount of game-ending artifacts, it might be lower than the amount of game-ending sorceries. I don't know that off the top of my head, but I guess what they're trying to say is your deck can have tutors TM, but it really depends on the kind of tutor that the deck is running. An Omni tutor like a Vampiric Tutor would be very much at the top. Now, while I don't necessarily agree with this system entirely, I feel like it is at least better than the current system we have, where everybody says their deck is a power level 7, and then there's extra steps on top of that. Now, there were complaints in the Magic community about this bracket system, saying that this is just power level 7 with extra steps. And you know what? I want to agree with you, but I don't. Because the way this bracket system seems to work is that anything at power level 1 is going to be stuff that is in precons, and stuff that is consistently printed at precons, not the one-off, oh no, we put a Dockside Extortionist in here, I guess that means it's a power level 1 card. No, cards that consistently make their way into precons and are reprinted at that power level all the time. But if you look at the right side of the graph here, you can see that Armageddon is a card that puts the entire game to a permanent stop. Drannith Magistrate is a card that slows the game down for a certain bit, and Thalia, Guardian of Thraben is a piece that slows the game down far less than Drannith Magistrate. So I guess this is what they would be doing. It's not that stacks decks suddenly become 3s and 4s, it's the type of stacks you have in your deck, the types of tutors you have in your deck. Now, Gavin noted that this would be a system where having a single card of this power level would move your deck into that category. This is not a hard system, mind you. This is not a replacement for Rule 0. This isn't a replacement for having actual social conversations with your friends. Which, by the way, I want to go ahead and have another aside here. I've had a lot of you comment in my comment section that you don't want to have a conversation with people about what kind of deck you're playing before you sit down at a table. And to that, I have one of two responses. Response 1 is, gee, golly willikers, I'm so sorry that you have to, in order to play a game with other people, communicate with those people. I am so sorry about that. And my other question, or my other response to that is slightly less snooty is, this is a social game. This is a game that requires sitting down with a group of multiple people and having conversations. I'm sorry that you don't like having those conversations, but typically the people who don't like having those conversations are the people that this bracket system is going to help out the most. Because instead of having to have a long conversation about how you have an Eldrazi deck, but not that kind of Eldrazi deck, or you have a Stacks deck, but not that kind of Stacks deck, you can instead refer to the type of cards that are in your deck. Hey, my deck has 3 power level 4 cards. It's pretty high up there. My deck has 5 power level 3 cards and 8 power level 4 cards. My deck is in a very powerful spot. Hey, my deck's a precon. It's mostly 1s and 2s. It's the cards that they threw in here, and this is what I brought to the table. This system makes it way easier to communicate how powerful your deck is. It's a lot like that Canadian Highlander system where individual cards yield their power to the deck and the majority of the cards in your deck end up not contributing to the power level at all. And to people who say that this isn't a good or accurate system, no. So I can extrapolate on that a little bit. It is a better system than what we've been working with. It may not be a perfect system, but no system we ever develop will be perfect for Commander. So let me go ahead and ask you a question. For a Sol Ring, which Gavin has said will be at level 1 due to it being a card that everybody has access to. Sol Ring is the exception, not the rule, though. So Sol Ring would be a 1, and Mana Crypt, a card like that, would be at a level 4. Ignoring the position of Sol Ring in the format. There's always going to be an exception made for Sol Ring, as much as I'm begrudged to admit that. Ignoring its restriction, it would normally be at a power level 4 as well. Why is this? Because the game warps around it. The game warps around it entirely. If you play a Thalia, my game is slowed down a little bit, but the game is warped around the Thalia. If you play a Drannith Magistrate, the game is warped around the Drannith Magistrate. People can still play the other 99 cards in their deck, but they are still having to make most of their decisions based on that Drannith being on the board. If the Armageddon touches the board, well, that's it. Like, the entire game is warped around that. The actual trajectory of the game has been turned into whatever the Armageddon player wanted it to be, almost 100% of the time. So, with a card like the Moxen, or Sol Ring, or Mana Crypt, when you have had these cards at the start of your game, and other players have not had these cards at the start of their game, what has happened? Well, I guarantee you it's been one of 2 scenarios. Scenario A, you are now 5 to 6 turns ahead of them and you pub stomp everybody. Or Scenario B, well, everybody decides to gang up on you, and the fact that you dumped 5 or 6 cards out of your hand early means you're now out of gas because you couldn't follow it up. In either of these scenarios, you didn't have a great time, or you had a great time because the thing that you're looking for in Commander is winning. Please see my competitive versus fun video for examples of this particular conundrum. If you have one of those cards in your deck and you draw it in your opening hand, the game will be warped around it for an amount of time. Yes, players have some ability to play around these cards, but generally speaking, the game does warp around them. Now, we don't have a complete list of these cards, so take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt. There is a chance that some of the things that I'm saying will end up being tarnished by whatever examples are put into these multiple brackets. But in an ideal scenario, these game warping cards, if you have one or two of them in your deck, all it takes is you drawing them in a game, and suddenly everybody is going to have only one opinion of that deck going forward. And it is going to be that explosive or game warping experience that they all had to deal with. If your deck is made up of mostly the stuff from the pre-con, right, then chances are you might have this very powerful game, but you are not going to have this explosive game the way that you would with your Crypt or your Moxen, as an example. The game warping status of these accelerants or these stacks pieces or these tutors is the thing that this is meant to defend against. So if you, as a player, have one or two of these, it doesn't matter that you only have one or two of them, because if you draw it, well, you draw it, and we're going to be experiencing that game no matter what. I actually had a friend of mine that had an experience with trying to tweak a deck around these parameters. He had a Skithiryx deck, which, yes, is an infect deck, and yes, was very powerful, but he had it loaded with all kinds of tutors, and it was very, very consistent when he had his land drops. So he tried to tweak the deck by removing a good chunk of the lands so that there were plenty of games where he would not go off. This didn't work out very well and didn't end up creating fun games for him. His deck didn't get to go off very often, and the games where it did go off, nobody felt great because they just saw Skithiryx come down and a tutor for something to make it one-shot a player, and then that was it. The game was over in another turn or two. On the flip side, after adding an adequate amount of lands and removing these tutors from the deck, suddenly the deck felt more fair to play against by everybody. He was able to do more moves consistently, and yet he was not having these explosive or game variance moves anymore. Referring to this chart, the thing that made his deck more fun to play for everybody involved was not trying to figure out how to fix his deck within the parameters of being a level 4 high-powered deck. It was finding out how to lower his deck from a level 4 to the playstyle that he was trying to actually play, which was somewhere between a 2 and a 3. And I think that's going to be kind of the goal going forward for most of the Magic the Gathering community here. Most CEDH players are going to have these game warping cards in their libraries, and they're going to be able to play them just fine. And because they already weren't having a Rule 0 conversation anyway, I mean, that's really all CEDH is having Commander without the Rule 0 conversation, then these players are going to largely be unaffected by this power bracket system at all. Everybody else, on the other hand, will have a better way to communicate what their deck's power level is. Instead of having to do this very esoteric and very, very miasmic system of, my deck's a 7, but, which is how everybody starts their conversations when it comes to their decks, instead we can say, hey, my deck has 3 or 4 cards at power level 4. That's going to give us a pretty good idea of what your deck is trying to do now. That's going to give a fairly good signpost of what's there. Now, bear in mind, all of this is entirely dependent on this system having somewhat accurate rankings for these cards. And now that Wizards of the Coast is holding on to the system for Commander, there is a chance that this system can change drastically over the course of its lifetime. Cards that end up sitting at a 2 may end up migrating up to a 3 or a 4 as more data comes in. And that was another thing that Wizards noted during their live stream, was that they didn't have as much data for Commander because, unlike every other competitive format that they have, the data's not very clear-cut where Commander's concerned. You can't just look at amount of games that an Arcane Signet is in and amount of wins that a deck that contained an Arcane Signet has, and then extrapolate something meaningful from that data. There's 4 players at the table, and the experience playing Commander is very different than a competitive format, like I mentioned before. It's hard to extrapolate a consistent type of data from this, from Moto or anywhere else. This does lead us into the last part of this discussion, though, and that is that, well, quite frankly, I'm worried. I have every reason to believe that Gavin, personally, wants the best for Commander possible. I have every reason to believe that the people working at Wizards of the Coast who will be stewarding the Commander format will have everything in their pocket, will have every single resource they need available to them, and I believe that they are going to do their best to steward the format going forward. That is not my concern, though. My concern is that the Rules Committee prior wasn't beholden to a financial organization, at least not in a transparent way, not in a way that any of us could really see or verify or worry about. This was because they were a separate entity to Wizards of the Coast, with a Commander advisory group that was separate to Wizards of the Coast. Like, this was a system that meant that Commander got to be a very community-led thing. And Gavin noted over and over again that Commander would still be a community-led project, but with it being fully in the hands of Wizards of the Coast, I don't know what the hell that means. I want to believe those words, but I don't know what those words actually mean. What does a community-led project, a community-led game mean when all of the reins are in the hands of Wizards? We used to have a system where Wizards controlled the supply of the product, and the stewardship of that product was left mostly to the players. But now, the power level system is going to be in the hands of Wizards of the Coast, as well as the stewardship of the game. Now, I'm worried that we're going to find a situation where if a card like, say, Nadu gets printed again, the card will not be banned or taken care of in Commander in a timely fashion, because there will be a financial incentive for them not to do that. This is because, as much as I want to have faith in Gavin and the other members at Wizards of the Coast, I don't have faith in Hasbro. Hasbro has a habit of ruining most things that I enjoy. I used to be an avid Nerf fan during the COVID pandemic, and I learned very quickly that the worst Nerf items to play with all came from Hasbro, strangely, even though they were the ones that owned the Nerf brand. It was a very weird scenario. Finding out that Beyblade, which was also owned by Hasbro, had the equivalent of cheap knockoffs made in America for every single piece and part that we got over here in the States, that had an infinitely better Japanese alternative that you would have to ship over with special launchers and all kinds of stuff that was just not made available to us in the United States. That was a Hasbro decision. And with Magic the Gathering, we've routinely seen that Hasbro decisions, or what I think are Hasbro decisions, tank aspects of this game, which leads us back to the bannings of Dockside Extortionist, Mana Crypt, and Jeweled Lotus. Instead of making these cards more available to the player base, they instead decided that the correct thing to do with these pieces of fucking cardboard was to only make them chase cards that would forever be worth triple digits over time. Dockside did not get a reprint in a Commander precon. Dockside got a reprint as a Chase Mythic rare. Jeweled Lotus did not get printed down after being printed as a Chase card in Commander Legends. It got printed in higher Chase rarity varieties, and only as such. We never got cheaper versions of Jeweled Lotus. And Mana Crypt, God, Mana Crypt was such a weird thing because it routinely would fluctuate between $100 and $200, and it was always when it started to fluctuate towards $200 that a reprint would be ready, lowering its price a little bit, but never quite enough to stop it from getting back up to that chase card point. And Wizards definitely made a lot of money off of this, but most of that money definitely ended up being aimed at Hasbro. They are the bosses who want the finances to come in, while the people at Wizards of the Coast are doing everything in their power to steward a better game. This is a game first, and everything else second for people like Gavin at Wizards of the Coast. This is a financial stock portfolio investment for Hasbro first, and a game somewhere as a middling third, likely. And this is where I run into my issues with moving the stewardship over to Wizards. But unfortunately, this isn't the fault of the Rules Committee. This is the fault of the Commander community. People who decided that the monetary value Irrespective of how stupidly inflated this was on the part of Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro, people decided that the monetary value of these cards were so much more important than the actual value of human life that death threats en masse through anonymous channels or otherwise got sent to the Rules Committee over the course of several days. Enough that shortly after their ban, a ban that, again, I was a huge fucking fan of, they still decided that it was a safer option to hand things off to Wizards that has the resources and, quite frankly, gets paid to deal with this shit. And that is a terrible, terrible thing. This was a comment that was thrown to the Commander Rules Committee originally, and I responded to it on my original video talking about the bans, and I'll respond to it once more. The comment went, "I love how this rewards the wrong people. You just set a precedent that if you complain enough, we will ban something. Also, you rewarded people for not running interaction. Huge miss in my mind." Well, now we can honestly say that this was turned entirely on its head. I love how this decision, as necessary as it might have been, rewards the wrong people. We can now say that we are all part of a community that actively rewards the behavior of sending death threats to the people who do the thankless job of trying to give us a game that is fun and enjoyable for everybody. We did this. This is a thing that we fucked up with. We are now part of a community that set the precedent that if you threaten somebody long enough, they will step down. And instead of some esoteric thing about rewarding people for not running interaction, no. We're not going to do the dies to removal thing on top of all this. You know better than that. I know better than that. So instead, why don't we make it a point to be a better community going forward? We've already lost one of the things that made Commander one of the most special things in all of fucking trading card games. We've already lost that. Let's not lose more by being absolute fucking shitwads. Maybe? I don't know. That's just my 2 cents. Let me know what you all think in the comments section below. I know this has been a more somber video than usual, but all things considered, I don't think that there was any other way I could do this. Let me know what y'all think. Insert end of video tagline here. Hey, just wanted to give a quick thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who help keep me afloat and help keep this channel going. YouTube and Twitch are wonderful platforms, but at the end of the day, stability is not one of their strong suits. If you want to support my channel, then obviously Patreon is one of the best ways of doing that. Link is in the description. But I do want to personally thank everybody who has contributed to the channel. Those people would be Red Joker, Purple Poundini, Jemshin, Britzkrieg, Jupe the Malignant, Michael, Ravalern, Mabbity Babbity, Astral Frontier, Autumn and Angel, Nixie Chan, Mark Anthony, Victorian Alchemist, I'm not saying the last part of that, and you know that, Arcton Arclacier, Kiratorian, Dren Hadamata, Jordan M, John L, Lord Bleck, Smiling Game Master, and Fire Shard. And everyone else who supports my channel and lets me do what I do full time. This is a dream job of mine that I never believed that I would be able to take full time, and with your help, I've been able to do it. So thank you so very much for that. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you all enjoy, and I hope you all are having a wonderful time. I will see you all in the next one, hopefully.